The story begins in summer 2019 when I started some initial small scale doctoral research. Working with two contrasting organisations, a professional services firm and a chartered institute, I asked my participants to take photographs of the five spaces where they heard the most and the best organisational stories. I then analysed the results using a technique grounded visual pattern analysis pioneered by Harriet Short and Samantha Warren. As a senior knowledge and learning specialist at a global law firm, I've always been interested in how we use those informal stories, the stories that emerge in everyday conversation, and which organisational spaces facilitate such storytelling. In a 2020 article, Van Hulst and Beamer observed that the relationship between stories and organisational settings has never been systematically investigated. It was that relationship I was keen to explore, and in particular, to what extent stories were drawn to the liminal spaces in our organisation. Spaces that were, in some sense, off the geographical grid, or spaces of transit, or spaces of the margins and borders. Because if they were, perhaps organisations, planners, and designers might see these spaces in a different, more valued light. And the photographs I received were almost exclusively of such spaces: changing rooms, toilets, receptions, cafes, pubs, kitchen areas, and Smoker's Corner, to which we will return shortly. I also wanted to unpick the work these stories do. With a career in knowledge management, I appreciate stories are used to diagnose problems and formulate solutions. Now, I did find evidence of that, but I also found something else. A recurring theme was the use of stories to diffuse tension, purge emotions, and to come to terms with troubling experiences. Storytelling was identified as a means of emotional and psychic survival. One interviewee, soon to retire, recounts how a colleague who she would regularly bump into in the morning with her coffee and porridge, learning of her departure, laments, "I don't know what I'm going to do when you leave. Who am I going to talk to?" Without the opportunity to tell such stories, there is uncertainty and concern. Survival is compromised. The spaces implicated in such story work were various. In a communal kitchen, colleagues told stories that voiced vexations about co-workers or deadlines or personal concerns. As one participant noted, it's almost an environment where people feel comfortable to voice their frustrations. A cafe area was described as cathartic. It's where people download on how their day or their week is going. Now, there's a thread of research that recognises the release stories provide. For example, Tangolini's work on how paramedics use stories. And this idea of release was represented in the participants' metaphoric language. Stories were a way to let it out, to get things off my chest, to blow off steam, to vent, or just to breathe out. It's as if without stories, the self would either implode or explode from the pressure exerted within and without. Tangolini notes how, through venting such stories, it helped the paramedics to make sense retrospectively of distressing or disturbing call-outs. What may have been experienced at the time as a series of fragmented or confusing events that eluded control now received coherence and structure through the narratives that were imposed. But such venting is also valuable for the story listener. It can perform beneficial knowledge work. By understanding the desperation faced by our colleague who felt they had nowhere else to go, one HR specialist could intervene by offering help, guidance, or speaking with others to solve the problem. Similarly, for a project manager, the stories of frustration that she heard surfaced concerns and objections about project timelines or directions that she could then address. They also helped knowing in a different way. Hearing a story from a colleague about their sleep deprivation caused by a young baby, a training manager noted, "I learned more about this person in 60 seconds on a personal level in that space, a cafe area, than I had working in the team for the past year." But let me now take you to the space that, for me, epitomised the cathartic power of stories. But be warned, it's not a pleasant place, variously described as stinky, wet, windy, uriny. Welcome to Smoker's Corner. On the edge of a street adjacent to the organisation's building, this is where, during a period of change, people would gather and talk through their concerns. But it's also a place where participants might take a colleague who is upset and wants a chat. It also promotes well-being in other ways. For one participant, it is a place of speculative, ludic storytelling, wordplay and nonsense. For example, tales about what it would be like to have horses' hooves and would you need a tail to go with them. Or for another, a place to be alone with their own reflections and stories. It's where you can turn off your CPU and reboot. The importance of this space for maintaining mental balance was emphasised by one comment. Without it, I would go insane. I think Smoker's Corner also suggests the role of liminal space in affording such stories of survival, endurance and resistance. It's a space physically on the margins of both the street and the organisation. It's also a space that blurs work and non-work roles, for the storytelling may relate to events both in the office or home domain. Also, this wet, windy, mundane street corner carries no expectations of what should take place there. Unlike more privileged front stage organisational spaces, it suggests no prescribed forms of behaviour. It's also devoid of ownership, a neutral space, a non-territory, where the usual hierarchies fail to exert control. Interestingly, for one participant, going there was like crossing a threshold so you can switch on a different part of yourself. Seemingly in this betwixt and between space, the organisational mask can slip. Victor Turner referred to the anti-structure of liminal space. So perhaps liberated from the structural constraints of hierarchy, sanctioned behaviour and organisational expectations, stories of frustration and anxiety are free to be told. This is a space that slips the net of classification. But look carefully, and you may notice something else about this and the other photographs. They were taken with the instruction to avoid including people. Consequently, they now stand as an unsettling portent of what many workspaces were to become as a result of the COVID lockdown. Spaces empty and denuded of life. This absence of presence evokes Mark Fisher's definition of the eerie. There is nothing present where there should be something. It may be fanciful, but the social dislocation of the last few months, which several commentators have identified as a liminal period, seems symbolised in this disorientating absence. So with many of the people in these two organisations still working from home, the question is, to where has the storytelling migrated? Have Smoker's Corner, the cafes, the toilets, the changing rooms, the receptions been replaced by Zoom, Slack, Teams, WebEx and Jabber? Or are stories devoid of their natural habitat increasingly faced with extinction? And if so, this has real and damaging consequences. In workshops that I've run in my own and other organisations, a key consequence of home working that is invariably identified is the loss of those casual collisions, those random encounters that spark conversations and stories. Even the Bank of England, in a speech by their chief economist, Andy Haldane, rued the loss of serendipity, which they claimed was the cradle of creativity. Our interactions and exchanges via technology are deliberate, not random, with defined times and attendees. This is a space of structure, not anti-structure. It's impossible to bump into someone on Zoom as you would in the lift or the corridor. And for my participants, many stories arose as a result, as one described it, of gatherings and paths crossing. Indeed, Professor Aris Kalanides, one of the editors of the Routledge Handbook of Place, argues that virtual space is not a place in the sense of a meaningful location. It engenders no sense of place and consequently drains emotions, not through consumption but numbness. And maybe it's that numbness that is the enemy of stories. In the next stage of my research, my aim is to explore stories and their organisational habitat in the COVID and the post-COVID world. And it remains to be seen whether this will be a tale of abundance, survival, or extinction. Thank you.